33% of Americans support what just happened in Venezuela. 5 Republican senators broke ranks. ExxonMobil called the country uninvestable. And while the headlines scream regime change and oil takeover, wells across the Orinoco Belt are shutting down right now, threatening to make recovery exponentially harder. In the next 4 minutes, you'll discover why this went from military operation to political crisis in 6 days. What ExxonMobil's CEO actually said that Wall Street isn't repeating, and why the wells shutting down today could cost $10 billion to restart tomorrow. I'm Mark Roach, petroleum engineer and dealmaker, 30 years of experience in upstream oil and gas around the world. This is FutureWise Energy. This is purely independent analysis. So 6 days ago, I gave you the Venezuelan operation breakdown. 303 billion barrels, the world's possibly the largest reserves in the world. And their production collapsed to 900,000 barrels per day. And then the Trump administration was seizing operational control. The geopolitical play was clear. What wasn't clear was whether Americans would support it, whether Congress would push back, and whether oil companies would actually help and commit capital. Now we know. The answers are no, yes, and heck no. Start with the public opinion, because this matters for how long this plays out. There's a poll conducted January 5th through 7th, right after the operation. 33% of Americans support removing Maduro. 33%. Well, that's not a mandate. That's a problem. The split is brutal. 65% of Republicans back it, 11% of the Democrats, 11%. Cliff Young at this polling agency said, Americans worry Venezuela will lead us down the path to another forever war. Another group, YouGov, found 56% oppose military intervention. More telling, 66% believe Trump should seek congressional authorization before using force. And only 22% call Venezuela a national emergency for the United States. 52% explicitly say it is not. Well, that sentiment hit Congress fast. January 8th, one day after my last update on Venezuela, the Senate voted 52-47 to advance a war powers resolution requiring congressional approval for future Venezuela military action. 5 Republicans broke ranks. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Rand Paul, Josh Hawley, Todd Young. 3 of them, Collins, Hawley, and Young, had opposed earlier efforts to restrict Trump before Maduro's capture. That shift signals growing concern about mission creep. Senator Todd Young said Trump campaigned against forever wars, and I strongly support him in that position. A drawn-out campaign in Venezuela involving American military would be opposite of ending foreign entanglements. Trump called their votes stupidity, threatened primary challenges. The resolution still needs House passage and would face a veto, but the signal is sent. Opposition exists within his own party. Now, the oil industry meeting, Friday, January 10th. White House sits down with ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips executives. Trump reportedly pitches a $100 billion investment program. The response was ice cold. Exxon CEO Darren Woods delivered the bluntest assessment. He called Venezuela uninvestable without sweeping structural reforms. His exact words, ExxonMobil operates on multi-decade investment horizons and cannot commit capital without durable legal and commercial frameworks. He outlined requirements, reforms to Venezuela's hydrocarbon laws, credible investment protections, a functioning legal system capable of enforcing contracts. This caution stems from experience. ExxonMobil entered Venezuela in the 1940s. I knew some of these people. They saw assets expropriated twice, most recently during Chavez's nationalizations in the mid-2000s. Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil, made it clear that any third re-entry requires significant changes to avoid repeating these past losses. ConocoPhillips is owed approximately $12 billion in related to Chavez-era expropriations. They said they'd monitor developments, but won't speculate on future activities or investments. Chevron emerged as the lone optimist, accounting or announcing plans to boost production 50% over 18 to 24 months. And that confidence reflects their unique position. They're already in Venezuela. They never left. And they currently operate joint ventures producing 200,000 to 240,000 barrels per day under special treasury license. Chevron loaded 1.68 million barrels during the first week of January. That's the fastest pace in 7 months and nearly 5 times their December volume. As of January 13th, no company has disclosed a binding investment commitment, any project approvals, or definitive agreements resulting from that meeting. Zero. Trump pitched $100 billion, and the check didn't get written. While the majors hesitated, commodity traders moved. Vital and Trifigura secured preliminary U.S. licenses to negotiate and export Venezuelan crude. By January 12th, they were receiving at least 4.8 million barrels for transfer to Caribbean storage. Vital approached Indian refiners offering Venezuelan crude at $8 to $8.50 a barrel discount versus the Brent price that was being delivered. Both traders contacted PetroChina about Murray heavy crude, and that's a redirection of flows from China and Russia toward U.S.-aligned markets, though economics still remain challenging. Infrastructure reality checks are converging. Francisco Monaldi at Rice University's Baker Institute estimates returning Venezuela's 1970 peak of 3.5 million barrels per day requires $10 billion in annual investment over the next decade, $100 billion total. Rystad Energy provides granular numbers. Venezuela needs $53 billion over 15 years just to maintain current production of about 1.1 million barrels per day. To ramp above 1.4 million requires an additional 120 to 130 billion through 2040, a total of $183 billion. Carios Satellite Intelligence described infrastructure as catastrophic in their condition. Approximately 1/3 of these oil storage capacity sites are inactive due to corrosion and lack of maintenance. Amway and Cardone refineries operate below 20% capacity, functioning as a de facto storage center. Venezuela's oil pipelines haven't been updated in 50 years. PDVSA, that's their national oil company, they estimate $58 billion is needed to restore them. $8 billion just to get pipeline infrastructure to the late 1990s condition. Energy Aspects projects projects that even under optimistic scenarios, Venezuelan output rises to only 1.3 million barrels per day by 2027, in a couple of years. A mere 200,000 barrel a day increase from now. The firm expects production to remain below 1.5 million when Trump leaves in 2029, even with sustained international investment. So here's the development that validates everything I told you January 7th about heavy oil recovery. PDVSA has begun shutting in wells across the Orinoco Belt due to storage constraints created by the naval blockade. Starting December 28th, before the military operation, PDVSA began shuttering wells as storage tanks filled with and tankers that couldn't load. So by late December, Orinoco Belt production dropped 25% to 663,000 barrels per day, down to 498,000 barrels a day. PDVSA planned to reduce Orinoco output by at least another 25%, targeting 500,000 barrels a day, which was a 15% cut to Venezuela's total production. The company is prioritizing shutdowns of the heaviest crude first, exactly as the technical analysis predicts. Junin region wells produced 8 to 9 degrees API, extra heavy crude, are closing first, followed by Orecchio and Carabobo, while lighter crude zones stay operational as long as possible. This sequence reflects technical reality. Extra heavy crude requires continuous thermal recovery operations. SAGD or CSS with diluent supplies are needed to create flow. The heavy oil won't move through pipes without being diluent. Both are being disrupted. Well, shutting down thermal recovery wells is considered the last resort due to operational difficulties and significant expenses of restarting them. Each shutdown risks permanent damages to steam chambers of the SAGD operation that they depend on. PDVSA asked joint ventures including Petrola Sanovensa from CNPC, Petro Prior from Chevron, Petro Boskin from Chevron to reduce production by disconnecting well clusters. Cenovesa prepared to disconnect up to 10 well clusters. U.S. escalated maritime enforcement. Well, January 7, U.S. forces seized 2 additional oil tankers, including one flying a Russian flag, bringing a total to at least 5 tankers as part of what Secretary of State Marco Rubio called oil quarantine. Rubio clarified that we have a quarantine on their oil, and that means their economy will not be able to move forward until conditions in the national interest of the United States and interest of the Venezuelan people are met. Some vessels from Venezuela's dark fleet escaped during the weekend immediately after Maduro's capture. Tanker trackers reported that at least 4 tankers, possibly as many as 16, got through before U.S. forces fully tightened enforcement. Department of Energy announced January 7 that U.S. is selectively rolling back sanctions to enable transport and sale of Venezuelan crude, including authorizing imports of U.S. diluent into Venezuela, critical for producing and transporting heavy crude. This selective relief aims to facilitate transfer of 30 to 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to the U.S. while maintaining this political and economic pressure. International reactions are forceful. China's foreign ministry called U.S. actions a typical bullying act, emphasizing China and other countries have legitimate rights in Venezuela which must be protected. Chinese state media described Beijing as deeply shocked. Stakes for China are substantial. Venezuela supplies 4 to 5% of China's oil imports, significant but manageable to replace. The more concerning, though, China is owed an estimated $10 billion in debt from the party that are to be covered by these oil exports. Chinese state companies, CNPC, Sinopec, China Concord, operate joint ventures and invested heavily in Venezuelan infrastructure. Chinese social media exploded with speculation about whether Venezuela sets precedent for Taiwan. Post about Maduro generating over 650 million views on Weibo by January 6th. Now, Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska warned if U.S. controls Venezuelan oil fields, they will control more than half of the world's oil reserves and could drive prices below $50 a barrel. Problematic for Russia budget planning. Legal justification came under criticism. Professor Mark Weller of Cambridge argues the operation constitutes unlawful use of force, violates Venezuelan sovereignty, lacks credible legal justification under UN Charter. Bloomberg legal analyst Noah Feldman wrote that the operation was illegal under both international and U.S. law, noting the most basic building block of all international law is the principle that sovereign countries govern themselves in the interest of their own citizens. Trump administration initially invoked Article 51 of UN Charter, claiming narcotics trafficking combined with hostile acts by Tren de Argua constitutes armed attack triggering self-defense rights. Now, legal scholars note this represents severe departure from conventional understandings of international law and past official U.S. positions. Political status remains ambiguous. Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as acting president July 5th by Supreme Tribunal after the court ordered her to assume interim powers due to Maduro's absence. U.S. positions on Rodriguez is unclear. Trump initially said U.S. would run Venezuela and work with Rodriguez to make Venezuela great again. Secretary Rubio walked this back, clarifying U.S. would not govern Venezuela but would maintain oil quarantine. Rubio added U.S. does not officially recognize Rodriguez's presidency despite Trump's statements. Rodriguez took a calibrated approach, publicly denouncing Maduro's capture as barbaric and kidnapping while simultaneously engaging diplomatically with Trump administration. She never stated Venezuela would never again be a colony of any empire, but showed willingness to cooperate on oil sector developments. January 10th, Venezuela began releasing political prisoners, including Virgilio Laverde, a youth coordinator for opposition leader Maria Corina Machado's party. Trump announced January 12th Venezuela is releasing many political prisoners as a gesture toward peace and the United States, and Venezuela is cooperating on oil infrastructure. Well, Trump also announced he canceled a previous anticipated second round of military attacks through U.S. naval forces that remain deployed in the Caribbean. Now, oil markets have remained largely unmoved. As I said, January 7, when you're staring at 2 million barrels a day of surplus in the world, even seizing control of the world's largest oil reserves, which aren't producing all that much anyway, doesn't really move the price. WTI was 56.25 January 7th, and by January 13th, markets had really remained relatively flat. And recent price increases are driven primarily by these Iran tensions and rather than the Venezuela problems. Structural oversupply is projected to average 2 million barrels per day through 2026 and continues to overwhelm geopolitical risk premiums. Wall Street Journal noted markets weren't really all that shocked by Venezuelan operation, precisely because the market understands Venezuelan production increases are years away and would require sustained investment. Even initial 30 to 50 million barrels being transferred to the U.S. represents oil that's already in storage or ready for export. That's not a sudden jump in daily production. Several critical issues remain unresolved, though. How will U.S. and Venezuelan structure legal protections to satisfy oil majors' demand for durable investment protections extending beyond Trump's term? What specific sanctions will be permanently lifted versus conditionally suspended? How will proceeds from Venezuelan oil sales be held in U.S.-controlled accounts actually be dispersed for the benefit of the American people and the Venezuelan people? Trump initially said the U.S. would run Venezuela temporarily and then extended the timeline, saying efforts could take much longer than a year. Now, what constitutes the end of this state? How will competing claims on Venezuelan oil revenues, including China's $10 billion debt, the Russian investments, all be adjudicated? What will it cost to restart Aramco belt? I mean, these wells have now been shut in, and who's going to pay for it? 6 days add layers of complexity in domestic political opposition stronger than anticipated. International condemnation is more forceful than expected. Corporate commitment more cautious than hoped. Infrastructure challenges more daunting than acknowledged. My heavy oil technical analysis that I presented back on January 7th provides the fundamentals around engineering for understanding why production of heavy oil takes a decade and 100 to 183 billion dollars, even under optimistic scenarios. Resources don't just produce themselves. Technology doesn't run itself. Operations do matter. Execution matters. Stability and institutional continuity matter. Possessing the world's largest oil reserves means nothing without operational capacity, political stability, legal frameworks, and sustained capital investment. The next chapters will determine whether US and Venezuela can build that foundation or whether this becomes another case study in limits of military intervention as industrial policy. The wells shutting down today in Junin and Waco and Carabobo, those aren't just production numbers, they're steam chambers collapsing, thermal recovery operations stopping, diluent supply chains breaking. Every day those wells stay shut in makes restart exponentially harder and more expensive. That's not politics. That's physics and engineering. And the market's already telling you it doesn't believe the recovery timeline. Ask yourself, are you positioned for what the data actually shows or what the headlines promise? The gap between those two, well, it keeps widening. I'm Mark Roach, and this is FutureWise Energy.